In 1976, Frank Sinatra was mid-song in front of 80,000 screaming fans when he did something no superstar had ever done. He stopped the entire concert, silenced his 50-piece orchestra, and crossed the stage to comfort a terrified, disabled child. Security froze, the audience gasped, and for 3 agonizing minutes, nobody knew if the show would go on. But what could possibly make the chairman of the board abandon his own performance at the peak of his comeback? And why did what happened next bring an entire stadium to tears? The desert heat had finally broken by the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, but the air inside the stadium still shimmered with body heat and anticipation. The massive crowd had traveled from every corner of the country to be here, cramming into temporary bleachers erected specifically for this night. It was September 1976, and Las Vegas had never seen anything like it. Frank Sinatra's comeback tour had been selling out arenas for months, but this outdoor spectacle was different, bigger, riskier, a statement that the king still had his crown. The stage itself was a marvel of engineering, 3 levels high, wrapped in lights that could be seen from the highway miles away. Behind Frank, a 50-piece orchestra sat in perfectly arranged rows, their music stands gleaming under the spotlights. The brass section alone had more musicians than most entire bands. Nelson Riddle's arrangements had been drilled until immaculate, every crescendo timed to the millisecond, every pause calculated for maximum impact. This wasn't just a concert. It was a precision instrument designed to prove that Frank Sinatra was still untouchable. From the stage, Frank could see the entire sprawling mass of humanity stretched out before him like an ocean. The lights were blinding, but he'd learned decades ago how to read a crowd by sound alone. They were with him tonight. Every note, every pause, every perfectly timed snap of his fingers sent waves of electricity through the stadium. Women in the front rows wore their best dresses, diamonds catching the light. Men in suits and ties sat beside them, drinks in hand, transported back to the golden age when Sinatra owned every room he entered. He was halfway through "I've Got You Under My Skin," and the orchestra behind him swelled with that familiar arrangement that had defined his career, the one that made grown men weep and young women remember why their mothers had screamed at the Paramount Theater 30 years ago. But an unease rippled through the venue. Frank's eyes, sharp despite the glare of the spotlights, caught movement at the edge of the stage. Not the usual bustle of crew, but something frantic. Security guards were rushing toward stage left, their movements urgent and clumsy. He could see people in the front rows standing, pointing toward the side of the platform. A ripple of confusion was spreading outward like a stone dropped in still water. He kept singing, his voice never wavering, but his jaw tightened. The conductor noticed it too, glancing over his shoulder, then back at Frank, with a question in his eyes. Frank gave him nothing. Not yet. The show doesn't stop. That was the rule he'd lived by since the Paramount Theater days when teenage girls fainted in the aisles and he just kept crooning. You never break the spell. Never let them see you sweat. Never acknowledge that anything exists outside this moment, this song, this perfect illusion of control. His father had taught him that back in Hoboken. You finish what you start, no matter what. Every professional bone in his body screamed at him to keep going, to trust that his people would handle whatever was happening out there. But the commotion was growing. More guards now, their yellow security jackets bobbing through the crowd like buoys in a storm. Someone was shouting, the sound cutting through even the wall of orchestral music. The sound system was too loud for Frank to make out words, but he could feel the tension building in that section, like a thunderhead about to break. His fingers tightened around the microphone, the metal warming under his grip. The band played on, oblivious or professional enough to ignore it. Thousands of faces still gazed up at him in adoration, unaware that anything was amiss, lost in the romance of the melody. But Frank knew an emergency was unfolding. And in the split second between one phrase and the next, with the orchestra building toward the climax and 80,000 people waiting for his voice to soar, he made a decision that would change everything. But to understand that choice, you had to know the man making it. Frank Sinatra was tired, not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep could fix. The bone-deep exhaustion that comes from 3 decades of living at full throttle. At 60 years old, his knees ached from the old injury he never talked about. The one from that bar fight in '48 that left him limping for a month. His throat felt raw from back-to-back performances, 7 shows in 9 days, and the doctors had warned him about pushing too hard after the health scare last spring, when his heart had done that weird flutter thing that scared him more than he'd admit to anyone. But he'd pushed anyway, because that's what Sinatra did. That's what Sinatra had always done. Weakness was for other people, for the ones who didn't have what it took to make it in this business. This tour was supposed to be a victory lap. After years of critics saying he was past his prime, that rock and roll had made him irrelevant, after the younger generation dismissed him as their parents' music, something safe and boring and old-fashioned, after Columbia Records tried to shelve him like yesterday's news, and the Vegas hotels started booking younger acts in the prime slots, here he was, selling out stadiums. The ticket sales spoke louder than any review. Every soul in attendance had paid top dollar to see him tonight, and he'd be damned if he'd give them anything less than his absolute best. Every show had to be flawless. Every note had to remind them why he was still the chairman of the board. Backstage before the show, he'd been in rare form, joking with the band, sharing stories about the Rat Pack days when Dean would show up drunk and Sammy would steal the show with a tap routine. He'd done his Brando impression to make the trumpet player laugh, the same bit he'd been doing for 20 years that still killed. But his longtime pianist, the one who'd been with him since the Capitol Records days, had noticed him popping aspirin, massaging his temples with that distant look that meant the pain was worse than he'd admit. "You okay, Frank?" The answer was always the same. "Never better, pal." It was the performer's code. The unspoken rule of show business that his mother had drilled into him when he was barely old enough to carry a tune. The audience paid to see a king, not a tired old man with aching joints and mounting doubts about whether this was all still worth it. The weight of expectation pressed down on him every night, heavier with each passing year. These people didn't want vulnerability. They wanted old Blue Eyes, the chairman of the board, the guy who owned every room he walked into and made it look easy. They wanted the swagger, the charm, the untouchable cool that had defined an era, that had made Bobby Soxers faint and made grown men wish they could be him for just one night. And Frank had spent a lifetime perfecting that armor, polishing it until you couldn't see the cracks underneath, until even he sometimes forgot where the performance ended and the real man began. But right now, standing on that stage with confusion spreading through his audience like wildfire, with every pair of eyes in the stadium watching his every move, Frank felt something crack. The conductor was looking at him, baton raised, waiting for a signal to continue or stop. The band was reaching the bridge, the moment where his voice was supposed to soar into that impossible note that proved he still had it. Thousands upon thousands were watching, expecting magic, expecting the Frank Sinatra they'd seen on album covers and in movies. And somewhere in that crowd, a crisis was unfolding. Someone vulnerable needed help, someone small and terrified. For the first time in his career, Frank Sinatra didn't know what to do. The cardinal rule of showmanship. That was the altar where he'd sacrificed relationships, health, and peace of mind for 40 years. But the commotion wasn't dying down. If anything, it was getting worse, more urgent, more desperate. And in that moment, suspended between the man and the myth, between who he was supposed to be and who he actually was underneath all the carefully constructed layers, Frank made a choice that went against every instinct he'd ever developed. He chose to stop. Frank's hand shot up mid-phrase, cutting himself off with the kind of abruptness that felt almost violent. The gesture was sharp, unmistakable, a conductor's command. The orchestra stumbled to a halt, brass notes dying in awkward, overlapping gasps. The sudden silence hit the stadium like a physical force. The collective hum of the crowd, which had been singing along just seconds before, stopped. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd, a collective, "What's happening?" that seemed to echo off the mountains surrounding the valley. Frank stood at the edge of the stage, microphone still in hand, his eyes locked on that section where the chaos had erupted. The spotlights felt hotter now, more accusatory. Stage managers were rushing into the wings, headsets crackling with urgent chatter. His personal security detail started moving toward him, but Frank waved them off with an irritated flick of his wrist. He wasn't in danger, someone else was. "Hold on," he said into the microphone, his voice cutting through the confusion with that distinctive authority. Not aggressive, but absolute. "Something's going on out there. Where's the boy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Security guards were rushing toward the side of the stage, and now Frank could see it. a small wheelchair at the edge of the platform, brought up by staff moments before the show for what was supposed to be a special moment. And the sound that cut through everything else was a child's cry, high-pitched and terrified. The kind of sound that bypasses your brain and goes straight to something primal. A stage manager appeared at Frank's elbow, trying to whisper an explanation, probably suggesting they handle it quietly, keep the show moving. But Frank wasn't listening. His eyes had found the source now. A young boy, maybe 7 years old, positioned stage left as part of a planned surprise. His small body was twisted in the chair, arms flailing in that uncontrolled way that spoke of cerebral palsy or something similar. The child's caretaker had stepped away for just a moment, and now he was alone and absolutely terrified. The crowd had figured it out now. From their seats, thousands of people could see the small wheelchair on stage, the child in distress. The atmosphere had shifted from celebration to collective concern in less than 30 seconds. People leaned forward in their seats, whispering to their neighbors, trying to understand what was happening. Frank handed his microphone to someone. He didn't even look to see who, and started walking. Not back toward his dressing room, not to confer with his manager, but across the stage toward the wheelchair. His band members exchanged glances, uncertain. This wasn't how the planned moment was supposed to go. You don't stop mid-song, you don't abandon the performance. You finish the number, then acknowledge the guest. But Frank was already crossing the stage, moving with surprising speed for a man battling old injuries. Security scrambled to follow, uncertain whether to intervene. The band members froze, instruments silent. His eyes were fixed on that wheelchair, on that crying child at the edge of the platform, and nothing else mattered. From their seats, the audience watched in stunned silence as Frank Sinatra crossed the stage toward the distressed child. 80,000 people held their breath. Some stood to see better. Others leaned forward in their seats. The collective murmur that had filled the stadium moments before faded into an almost reverent hush as they realized what they were witnessing. Frank kept walking across the stage, his focus absolute, the performer's mask completely gone. This wasn't the untouchable legend. This was something raw and human, instinct overriding image. It took less than 30 seconds to cross that distance, but it felt like an eternity. The stage lights beat down on them both as Frank knelt beside the wheelchair. The boy was still crying, his frame rigid with fear, his hands clenched into fists. Up close, Frank could see the leg braces, the special supports built into the chair. The way the child's head tilted at an angle he couldn't quite control. 80,000 people watched from their seats, the stadium holding its collective breath. His joints protested sharply. Tomorrow would bring consequences, he knew, but he pushed through the pain. Kneeling on the stage floor, he was at eye level with the boy now. The massive organism of 80,000 souls watched in silence from the darkness beyond the lights. "Hey there, pal," Frank said softly, his voice gentle in a way that people who only knew him from records would never believe. "What's your name?" The boy hiccuped, tears still streaming down his face, but the crying had quieted slightly. Frank waited, letting Michael catch his breath, his attention completely focused on the child in front of him. A stage manager crouched beside them, speaking quietly. "His name's Michael, Mr. Sinatra." The caretaker stepped away for just a moment. Frank nodded without taking his eyes off the boy. "Michael, that's a strong name. You know what, Michael? I'm a little scared too. All these people, all these lights. It's a lot. Isn't it?" Something in Frank's voice, that famous instrument that had seduced millions, seemed to reach through Michael's panic. The boy's breathing started to slow, his eyes, wide and unfocused before, locked onto Frank's face with sudden recognition. "You know who I am?" The question came gently, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Michael nodded, just barely. "Then you know I don't let my friends stay scared. We're gonna find your nurse, okay? But first, I need you to do something for me. Can you take a deep breath, like this?" Frank demonstrated, exaggerating the inhale, and Michael, still shaking, tried to copy him. Behind them, security had finally caught up, forming a protective circle. His manager's voice cut through, urgent and annoyed. The show, the schedule, 80,000 people still waiting. He ignored all of it. Someone tapped his shoulder. He shrugged them off without looking. "There we go," he said as Michael's breathing evened out. "You're doing great, kid. Really great." A woman rushed back onto the stage from the wings, Michael's caretaker, who had stepped away for just a moment. "Michael! Michael!" she cried out. She was sobbing, apologizing, explaining how she'd only turned her back for a second. Frank stood, his body protesting audibly, and nodded to her. The relief on her face was overwhelming, but Frank wasn't done. He reached down and gently took Michael's small, twisted hand in his own. The boy's fingers, which had been clenched in fear, slowly relaxed. Frank stood and raised their joined hands high above their heads, and then, with a showman's instinct that never truly left him, turned toward the audience. The stadium erupted. Everyone rose to their feet, and the applause that rolled down from the cheap seats in the back to the VIP section in front was deafening. It wasn't the polite appreciation they'd been giving his performance earlier. This was something rawer, more genuine. People were crying, not just in Michael's section, but scattered throughout the entire venue. They'd witnessed something that had nothing to do with music or celebrity or entertainment. They'd watched a man, just a man, do the right thing when it mattered most. Frank helped the caretaker stabilize Michael's wheelchair, made sure they were both okay. He placed a gentle hand on Michael's shoulder one last time, then slowly straightened up. The orchestra members behind him sat in stunned silence, instruments resting in their laps. The conductor watched, waiting, tears visible on his face even from a distance. Frank walked back to center stage, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood for a moment in the lights, looking out at the sea of faces. Someone handed him his microphone. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. No pretense now, no cool facade. He looked tired and human and utterly real. "That kid," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Michael? He reminded me of something I forgot somewhere along the way. We get so caught up in the show, in giving people what they paid for, that we forget we're all just trying to get through this together, you know?" The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "So this next song," Frank continued, "I'm singing it for Michael, for everyone who's ever felt scared or lost or alone. Because that's what music's supposed to do, isn't it? It's supposed to remind us we're not alone." He signaled to the conductor, and the opening notes of "Put Your Dreams Away" filled the stadium. Not the song that was scheduled, but something softer, more tender. Frank's voice, when it came in, had a quality it hadn't possessed earlier in the show. The flawless technique was still there, but now it was wrapped in something more valuable, genuine emotion. Years later, people who were there that night would struggle to explain what made it so unforgettable. It wasn't just that Frank Sinatra had stopped his show. Plenty of performers had dealt with emergencies. It was the completeness of his transformation, the way he'd shed every layer of celebrity and artifice and become simply a man who saw a child in distress and couldn't walk away. In that moment, no one in that stadium saw an icon. They saw their own best selves reflected back at them, and it changed something fundamental in how they understood both fame and humanity. Michael kept that memory for the rest of his life. The night Frank Sinatra held his hand and told him it was okay to be scared. And Frank, despite performing thousands more shows in his career, would say in a rare interview years later that the moment he knelt beside that wheelchair was when he finally understood what it meant to be the voice. Not the voice of a generation, but a voice for the voiceless. Not a king on a throne, but a man in a crowd, doing the only thing that mattered, showing up.